Ow.
This is Rob Neyer, and you are watching the Break It Down show.
I know Rob Neyer. How great is this? I seem to start every show off with this. Look, you've got a very successful show. You do the podcast for the Saber folks. Um, I start off the Sabercast. I start off every show, and I'm like, I love that we get to do this. I love that we've done one face to face up in Portland. I just think it's the neatest thing that you can build a relation. Heck, Rob, I'd even say we were friends. Like if I go to Portland, I feel like I need to check in with you. I just think this is the neatest thing that we get to do this and also talk about something that we both love. What do you want to talk about today in terms of baseball?
Well, first of all, I'm getting a feedback loop, so I'm
Do
not
you
sure
want
how
to
to fix it.
go out and come back in?
If you think that'll help,
Yeah, let's try it.
okay.
Okay. All right. Well, Rob works on fixing his connection, and hopefully it's his connection, not my connection. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes, you guys. But one of the things I'm going to say to you is, one of the ways you support the show is great. Is you can get the shirts that we make. I designed the shirts. By the way, if you ever want to design a shirt, let me know, and we can do it together and split the profits or whatever. But supporting the show through that or that link that's going by here, I'll put the link up here on the main screen so you can see it. If you just go to breakitdownshow.com and go to the PayPal link and you $5, $10, $20 a month, that is an enormous help. I'm trying to build this part of the business up. Like, hey, help fund the show, and it helps me buy ads so we exist on different platforms. It helps replace gear. All right, let's see if Rob. Hey, Rob, can you hear me? Okay.
I had my YouTube page
Oh.
open, and there's like about a 6-second delay, so that
Oh,
was
yeah.
totally my fault. Apologies.
So I'm not going to start all the way again, but I just want to say this. I love that we get to do this. You have your show, the Sabercast for the Sabermetric folks. You have all kinds of great guests on. I love listening to it. And we get to talk. And I was saying before, like if I go to Portland, I feel like, hey, I'm in Portland. I at least have to check in with Rob. Maybe we don't get together, but I care about you. I love your work. I love what you do. And I just really appreciate you coming on the show and getting a chance to talk baseball with you.
Well, I appreciate what you do and all of your support over these. I don't know, when did we get together at an actual coffee shop and record with people listening? About 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago.
It's got to be because we were there for the eclipse, and that was 17, I think. So
my daughter was a toddler, so it would have been probably 6 years ago.
Yeah, it's crazy, and that wasn't the first time we'd done this. We'd done them before that, so it's just it's great, and a lot of people who, in your silo, you're fairly well known. Like it's like, oh, Rob Neyer, everybody knows that guy in baseball. But even within baseball, it's like, who's Rob Neyer, right? And so it's like my show. There are 8 billion people that have never heard of me, but in my little tiny silo, it's like, hey, we've got these things and we get to exchange. I just love it, man. I just can't get enough. What is the most valuable thing about your podcast that has nothing to do with money or anything else?
The most valuable thing with the podcast? You mean for me personally or for listeners?
Yeah, like the unexpected things. Like I never would have thought, whatever.
Well, boy, we've done 205 episodes, and I'll be honest, it's difficult for me to go back and pick out highlights. I would have to look at the guest list.
Yeah.
But I would say that just in a general sense, the most valuable, and this is incredibly egocentric or self-centered, I get a chance, I have an excuse to ask interesting people to talk to me for 45 minutes to an hour for almost 4 years now. And what a gift that is. I can't just call up, I'm just going to throw a name that pops into my head, and it's one of the more famous ones because those are the ones that pop into your head. But I can't just call David Cohn and talk to him about his career for an hour, right? It's just not really something you can do. I have a lot of people in my phone, partly because of the podcast and partly because I did a story about baseball on Seinfeld 6 years ago or something, 7 years ago, 8 years ago. And so I have Paul O'Neill's phone number in my phone. I'm not going to call Paul O'Neill and just chat with him, right? It's first of all, he probably wouldn't pick up if he didn't know why I was calling. But second, it would just be rude. Nope, you don't do that.
Yeah.
Obviously. But I have an excuse to check in with David Cohn, at least when when he has a new book coming out. It's like, I wonder if David Cohn would come on the podcast. Hey,
Yeah.
he knows who I am. Unlike most players, he actually knows who I am, and he said sure. So, and that's just a real pleasure, because people who do what I do have a sort of a general curiosity about the world, and specifically about the baseball world, and all these questions that are in my head, there are people who I can ask, and I have an excuse to do that.
Yeah.
And I'm not sort of a natural conversationalist, but I would like to be a better one. So again, very self-centeredly, I get to practice talking to people every week, which is great for me because it's not something that comes naturally. So, I think it comes naturally for you. It's a good fit for you to do a podcast. I've never felt like for me that it's a good fit, but I try really hard, and I try to make the guests feel welcome, and I try to do my research. So at least it's not unpleasant for most of my guests, I think.
Yeah. No, it's not unpleasant at all. You're easy to talk to. And if I can be so bold, I think because I remember like when ESPN would stuff you in some late night thing because you're a Pacific Coast guy, and I'd watch and I would like, hey, there's Rob talking. This is way before I even knew you, and I remember those times, and it was not as like production like fancy, right? This is late night stuff, and you would come on and you would talk, and it's like, yeah, there's Rob. But now, like you're actually polished, and I'm not trying to like say like, oh, he was crap. You were always insightful and everything, but you're so comfortable with it now. At least when you come off to me, it's like, yeah, Rob's a pro and he knows how to do this. And I wanted to say this: when you were fishing for the name you were going to pull out, and I'm like, I think he's going to say David Cohn, and and I think when these things happen, I like to point him out because maybe there is a connection. Maybe we are, because you had a 200 episodes. I'm like, yeah, it's David Cohn, because that episode was interesting. And David has stood on the biggest stage, on the biggest moments. He's achieved the biggest thing you can do in baseball, win championships and pitch a perfect game and be the guy other teams get to get over the hump. And here we are, guys like us. We get to talk to Dave. I haven't had David Cohn on the show, but it's not unreasonable that I think I actually even asked you for his just some of these things don't work out, right? But I'm going to disagree with you on the reaching out and calling, maybe not Paul O'Neill and everything. But one of the things I've learned from talking to a lot of musicians, they're like, oh my gosh, you checked in with me? Huh. And you get to let some of these guys be regular person. Hey, I saw it was your birthday. I thought I'd give you a call, or I'm going to send you a video. So I think you can, as long as you're respectful. Like, I don't want to cause problems, but I'm just going to say happy birthday to you, or you popped into my head. And almost every single time I do that, I get a very positive response, or at least an acknowledgement, like, hey, Pete, good to hear from you. Thanks. We'll move on. And I don't abuse it, but I think that there is an even better connection that you can make with people. And so that when you do come asking, hey, you got a new book, it's like, oh, yeah, fuck Rob. It's great. Yeah, let's have Rob on this. I want to come on Rob's show.
No, I agree with all of that. I think that I sort of have I'm just going to spend the whole podcast revealing my various insecurities, but I think that I am so worried about being bothersome that, and that's, part of that is just due to that's a manifestation of insecurity. And I thought for a long time that most of us, our personalities are essentially manifestations of our insecurities, at least a lot of it. And it isn't that I'm more insecure than you are, or she is. It just means this is how mine happen to come out. Some people's insecurities come out in, they seem like the most confident person in the world, but they drive an F-350 in a city. Well,
yeah.
No offense if you have an F-350, Pete, but you don't need an F-350 if you're living in a city. It's ridiculous. It's a manifestation of insecurity. We all have them. And I try to be cognizant of that and not be too tough on people in my own mind, because, I'm afraid to text David Cohn on his birthday, you got a big truck. Those all spring from the same sort of feelings that we're not good enough or strong enough or masculine enough or
Right.
important enough or whatever it might be. And those all stem from our childhoods, all those different things. Um,
Yeah.
so I think that, we can all work on our insecurities and have
Yeah.
them influence our lives less, but they're always in there because they've been in there since we were 6 years old. There's no
Yeah.
way around them being there. What you can do is deal with them, and I think I've gotten better over the years. Part of that comes with um, having at least some success in your chosen field. I think that usually helps a little bit. I think just practice, um, knowing good people, listening to people, talking to people, all
Yeah.
those things help, but they never go
Yeah.
away completely. And I certainly am still struggling with. I was just, if you don't mind me expounding a little bit more on
Please.
podcasting, um, there are one or two people who I have tried pretty hard to get on the show over the last 4 years. So that's not a lot, right? That's a short
Hmm.
list. And I don't want to say any names, but one of them has been a huge movie star, not
Mm.
recently, but has been in the past. And I thought would just be the perfect guest for the show because there's a really strong baseball connection there. And I checked in with the people who sort of run his public life, and they said,
Hmm.
no, he can't do it. And I gave up. Well, that's not really how that needs to work, right? I listened to a
Right.
podcast. Um, the podcaster Sam Fragoso. I don't know if you know his podcast, Talk
Mm-mm.
Easy. He is one of the best viewers I've ever heard. Um, but I've always wondered. He gets these amazing guests, and I've always wondered how he does it. Well, it turns out he'll ask every month for years
Yeah.
and just doesn't give up.
Yeah.
Because you never
Yeah.
know, right? The 11th time
Right.
might be when it gets through. And
Yeah.
I've got to do a better job of and just plugging away and not being worried about rejection.
Yeah. My cat is here on my desk, by the way.
Excellent. This
So
might go viral. Nice.
exactly.
Pick it up and swing it around.
My God, very good.
That would go viral.
Yeah, the gosh, and I don't want to just stop podcasting, but I think these are great notes, like the insecurity. And I think to do this stuff well, you have to have an insecurity, because if you're too vain or too banal because you haven't dug into these things,
Right.
you it's it's too easy. And so it has to be hard in some way. And I talk about this all the time. Like, as I'm talking to you, I'm petting my cat. I'm cognizant of the people that are checking in on the show. I'm paying attention to all these things at once, and it's like learning. It's like you rock climb, right? And so you don't just start on a 513 delta, and like start climbing that way. You start where you can start, and it might be like literally like just scrambling along the side of a rock,
Right.
and you slowly add these skills in, and so you build confidence in something, but you're still always like, how do I get better at this? I developed this trick, or I stole this move, or I've moved my chalk bag to a new spot. All of these things are part of that exploration and trying to like minimize our weaknesses. And I'll tell you, I don't know about you, but I'm my own worst critic. Inside my head, like this, I'm the worst person ever. I don't get anything done. I'm lazy. I'm, whatever, right? Like I'm just this horrible person inside my head. And I'm always battling myself to be the good person I present. But boy, there's a lot of mess back in the warehouse when
Right.
Pete is being made and his actions are being created. And so I always have to work on certain things and then just relax on myself. And the other thing that I have learned is and I learned this from Joe Davis, by the way. He just said, slow down. When I listen to myself, this is right before, it was right when they announced that he was going to slide into Vin Scully's spot. It's like I would listen, I would listen, I would listen, and what I always realized was that I was just going too fast.
Right.
I would get excited, and so I'm always working on controlling my emotions. I want to be emotional, but I want to be like, oh, I'm emotional. I'm in a heightened state. Rob's in a heightened state. Okay, one of us has to be in control here, and so I have to like pull myself out of that state and manage these. And this sounds super hocusy pocusy, but it's part of what we have to do, and it's part of these things that we do in spite of ourselves, because I would rather be emotional excited talking about baseball, but right now we're talking about life and philosophy and confidence and all these other things.
Well, yes, and look, when I was a kid, I was constantly being told by teachers and parents, slow down. I literally can't understand what you're saying. You're speaking so quickly. And I don't think there was a moment when I just decided to slow down, but certainly having heard that enough times, I realized that if I wanted to be understood, and then later I started doing radio spots and ultimately being
Yeah.
on television every week on ESPN News. I don't know that I was getting those notes then, but there was a part of me that I'm always going to think that I speak too quickly.
Yeah.
So I do make sometimes a conscious effort to slow down. And you're right; it
Yeah.
depends on what the context is, right? Sometimes it's good to speed up and be really excited and
Yeah.
bring people. But when you're just having a conversation with somebody, the other thing that slowing down does is it actually gives you a chance to think about what you're going to say next,
Mm.
which some people find very uncomfortable. But if you listen to my podcast, you will hear me sometimes pause. And usually it's because I can't think of the right word. But I don't beat myself up about that. I feel like either maybe my editor's taking out a second here and there. I don't know. I don't think so. But I think it's okay to pause and think about what you're going to say next. And when I
Mm.
hear an interview with someone, and it's rare to hear someone pause because most people are afraid to pause. They're afraid to stop and think
Yep.
about what comes next. But whenever I hear someone do that, I don't think this person is too stupid to say the next thing. I think, oh, they're actually reflecting and trying to explain something as well as they can or teach me something. And I actually appreciate when someone pauses in an interview. It also actually is a little somewhat can be somewhat dramatic. You know, you're sort of on the edge of your seat. Oh, what are they going to say next?
Yeah.
So yes, I do. I like you. I try to take it more slowly than maybe my natural rhythm would be.
I'm going to see if I can bend us into the conversation back into baseball, because I do want to get into that. But I love this part of the conversation. I always say, like, I'm a Vince Scully School of Broadcasting graduate. You know, my TV radio degree was good, but I routinely will listen to the full Sandy Koufax Perfect Game that you can get. By the way, like, the archives in MLB.com are just fantastic. Like, you can go listen to all of these things, and you just like you want more. If you like baseball like I do. And I almost every year I listen to the '88 World Series Game One, because it's just a masterpiece all the way through. Garagiola says all these great things, but I slow down and I appreciate all of the things that are happening with Kirk Gibson. You know, he steps out of the box and the coaching is reminding in his head, and he steps back in. And then I don't know if I have the numbers right, but he hits it. Vin calls it, shuts up for I think a full 90 seconds. And then he says, you know, in the air of my pride, you know, and he does his next call. And then he shuts up again for like 2 minutes. And he's like, I don't have to describe what's going on. Now he's on TV broadcast, but
Right.
he just shut, and you don't even miss him because he's not there. It's like a drummer who leans back and grabs the sticks and lets the moment happen for however long it needs to be. The other thing I'll say about silence is I believe it is the best question an interviewer can ask.
Right.
Because if I just shut up and let you deal with the silence, you're going to volunteer something better than I could ever reliably ask a question.
That's right. That's one of sort of the standard tips now that master interviewers or reporters will hand out is don't be afraid of silence. We all have a natural tendency to want to fill those silences because they're awkward. But when you're interviewing someone, and especially if you're trying to get something out of them that maybe they would rather not divulge, which isn't nearly as often the case in this format, right? We're just having a conversation. But if you are reporting a story and you think that someone might know something that they're a little hesitant to tell you, that's the best things to do are to leave those pause, let them fill in the blanks, or ask exactly the same question more than once. Because one of the things that will happen sometimes is you'll ask the same question, and the person's thinking, "This idiot, I just answered that question." But because they don't want you to ask it a third time, they might give you a little more detail that you can
Yeah.
use. So yeah, there are some little interviewing tricks that are really not that complicated.
Yeah.
I think that the difficult thing to learn are not, you can make a list of 5 interviewing tricks, but the tough ones, and I'm not good at this at all, is reading someone else's mood.
Mm.
I don't really have that awareness of body language or whatever it might be. The tricks are easy, but the the those sort of empathic
Mm.
tools I don't really have access to, and I don't know that there's a way to learn them. Not not easily anyway. So there's probably a limit, but I certainly am trying to learn the tricks, the easy tricks, and those do help.
Yeah. It's well, okay, so I'm gonna slide us over to baseball all the way now, but you're right about that. And I'm gonna get us over to baseball by talking about Formula One. And so when I'm watching Formula One coverage and I watch baseball coverage and I watch football coverage, and I don't watch that much football anymore, but I notice that Formula One's drivers, the team man, I don't know how much you watch Formula One to pay attention to it, but these guys are media savvy. These guys are trained, they're briefed, they're practiced, and they always say things that are right on message. You can hear it. And I end up liking all of the drivers because of it. I don't know that baseball is as restrictive, and hopefully not. I mean, you get your wild cards like a David Wells or gosh, I mean, there's a lot of guys that say whatever they want to say, but the guys that tend to stay on message, like you'll never hear Kershaw say something negative about the Dodgers.
Right.
He just won't do it. And same thing with like just the guys who are pros. They're always on message. You see them talking, and sometimes I think, is that good for the brand, or do you want to see a little more human and like just like human characteristics from, oh, I don't know, pick a player, uh, Joey Bart from the from the Giants, like, can they just be a little more real? What are your thoughts? Like you work in media, or you have at least, and would you rather have the real person or the media prepared person
Oh, the
who
real
only
person
says things?
a
Yeah.
thousand times over, right? Because they're more interesting. The people who
Yeah.
are on message are there's nothing interesting about the message. Zero.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
uh, in Now, if someone can bring their individual acumen to
Mm.
light, that's on message to a degree, but and the race car drivers are the worst because they're not they're not speaking for a team. They are speaking for all the people whose names are on their jumpsuits,
Hmm.
um, or whatever they call them in racing now,
Yeah. Right.
and that are on the cars. Yeah, this my Cheerio Chevy was great today. It's like, okay, that's not really giving me a lot of information that I can use
Right.
as a fan.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but baseball players, they don't have yet all those names on the jerseys. So they don't have to say that stuff, or they don't feel like it's useful. Uh, they
Yeah.
are, for the most part, their only goal is to not embarrass the team name. Right? That's who pays their
Yeah.
salary. It really
Yeah.
comes down. Ultimately, it comes down to the money. The
Yeah.
Dodgers are paying Clayton Kershaw however many millions a year, so he's essentially not going to say anything critical about the Dodgers, which is perfectly understandable. But the most interesting players are the ones who let it go. I mean, I don't know if Reggie Jackson was a great teammate, but
Yeah.
boy, I'll bet it was fun to cover him in the 1970s because he didn't care.
Yeah. He didn't care. Yeah. I'm. We've been having this in the zeitgeist. We've been having this conversation of LeBron versus Michael Jordan on the GOAT, and I don't care about the GOAT conversation because they're both above like the greatness bar. They're both way up there, and I wouldn't want to eliminate Elgin Baylor without even discussing him and Wilt Chamberlain. So let's just say these guys are up there and they're great. But part of what we often hear is like modern players versus old players, but we force the old players into the modern context. But if Kevin Durant or I don't know, Shohei Ohtani was to show up in the 40s, we tend to reduce that conversation down to race and ethnicity. And that for sure plays a role in it. But I think like if you were to play in the 20s, you don't reliably have access to antibiotics at all. There's very limited coaching. There's very limited data. Everything's hunches, and there's no like. remember when we were kids, Brian Downing worked out, and it was like, well, that guy works out. That's going to be bad for his baseball career. Nolan
Right.
Ryan works out. That's not going to be good for these. It's like this is before people could reliably lift weights and bodybuild. So you would have to be back in that era under those conditions, either around smoke or probably smoking all the time, way more drinking, all the things that made it impossible. And I think, and this is the bigger part of this whole thing, if you look at human history, the greatest baseball player ever probably never even had a chance to play baseball and probably lived in a different country than, say, America, because there's billions of people that never had a chance to even play, like, I don't know, pick some Chaldean dude from northern Iraq from 2,000 years ago. That guy might have had the best musculature and he was a freak of nature, but it wasn't even wasn't even baseball back then.
Right.
What are your thoughts on comparing like the eras like that? And then can you, like, LeBron just became the all-time highest scorer, but like that's out of context. Like, how much more did he outscore his opponents in his era and all these different things?
I have spent a fair amount of time with those questions over the years, and I think ultimately, for the most part, well, there are two components to that discussion. One is what can I quantify,
Right.
or the things I can quantify, and then there are the things that I can't quantify. What would Shohei Ohtani's body have looked like if he grew up in the 1920s? I'm guessing he
Yeah.
wouldn't have been as tall or as strong, right?
Right.
Because humans weren't as tall or as strong, generally speaking, back then. I think the diet of Japanese citizens was completely different. I could be wrong about this, but I think it was quite different 100 years ago than it is today. And we know that humans generally are much larger, at least in Japan and the US, than they were 100 years ago,
Yeah.
especially in Japan. So there are so many unknowns that I almost think that trying to say what would he do? Look, if you took today's Ohtani and put him back in the 20s, he would be twice as good as the best pitcher and probably 1.5 times as good as the best hitter, i.e. Babe Ruth, or 1.2 times as better than whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
Because we know that athletes in every sport, everything you can time, at least all the timing and strength sports that have metrics, that are raw metrics, they're all way better now than they were 100 years ago,
Mhm.
or even 50 years ago, or 40 years ago. I think across the board, whether it's sprinting or weightlifting or whatever you want to choose. Why would baseball be any different? But then
Yeah.
people say, well, yeah, but what if Babe Ruth had? He didn't, and it's impossible to know what Babe Ruth would do if he played against Shohei Ohtani now. So I think it can be entertaining to sort of speculate about those sorts of things, but my brain doesn't really have a great deal of interest beyond that initial discussion.
Mhm.
Like, you could write
Yeah.
a book, what would Shohei Ohtani look like if he was born in 1912?
Right.
Okay, go ahead,
Right.
write that book, but I'm not sure I would be how interesting it would be. I would rather, because it's easier, just look at what the players did within their own context. That's hard
Yeah.
enough,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
we don't compare Babe Ruth to Ty Cobb, who were contemporaries for, they played in the same league. They played in the league together for more than a decade. All right, let's look at ballparks. Let's look at the pitchers
Oh,
they faced. Let's
yeah.
look at all these other things. Let's look at their clutch stats. I mean, there are lots of other, let's answer those questions first, and then maybe we can get into the really esoteric stuff. I happen to think that Shohei Ohtani he might not have the most baseball talent ever, because you're right, there could be a guy who was a maybe somebody who was a an Irish bowman in 1642
Right. Yeah.
had more baseball, a better baseball body than
Yeah.
Ohtani. But I think Ohtani is probably the most talented baseball player, actual player, that's ever lived. And I actually
Yeah.
think that it's not, frankly, I don't think it's debatable. I haven't run through
Yeah.
all the arguments because it's not my job anymore. But
Right.
if we assume that that athletic talents have only gotten higher over the years, how could one of the best pitchers, who's also one of the best hitters, not be the most talented player who's ever lived? And the counter argument I've heard is Babe Ruth, um, and I suppose the argument would be that Ruth was an excellent pitcher. He wasn't the best pitcher, but he was an excellent pitcher, and he was
Sure.
also not just an excellent hitter or even the best hitter, but the best hitter by some order of magnitude for a few years, right? Until everybody figured, oh, we can actually hit home runs. Okay, let's try that. But the fact that he was out homering whole teams
Right.
in 19, 20, and 21, that's a significant. So Ohtani cannot match that,
Right.
but in my opinion, just in terms of pure talent, which is to say ability to throw 95 to 100 miles an hour and hit a home run against someone throwing 95 to 100, I don't think there's ever been anyone like Ohtani. So I think that makes him, almost by definition, the most talented player who's ever lived. And by the way, you might recall there were some pretty smart people who 5-6 years ago thought that Ohtani could not do what he's doing, simply couldn't
Yeah.
be done. And the reason that people thought that, and I might have been one of those people, I don't remember, is that it hadn't been done. It hadn't
Mm.
been done in the milieu of Major League Baseball. It hadn't been done in 100 years. So of course it can't be done. Well,
Right.
one thing we know, you need to let incredibly talented people sort of set their own limits. And maybe it hadn't been done because nobody had been allowed to do it. Maybe John
Yeah.
Olerud could have done it. We don't know.
I think John Olerud would be great. The other thing is now that Otani's done it and the market is trying to follow, there are certain players that just break a mold, and they're very special in their unique ability. Ricky Henderson is one of these guys where everybody's still chasing, not as much as they used to, but they're chasing this ideal of a leadoff hitter. But you can't be what Ricky Henderson is. Like Vince Coleman was a great base stealer. Oh my gosh, one of the best ever. Tim Raines similarly, but those guys couldn't reliably either stay on the field or stay in their first spot because Ricky Henderson brought a mix of talent that just wasn't. It was generational. It wasn't a thing that was common. I want to go back to the Babe Ruth thing too. If you put Babe Ruth and had him born in whatever, like 1992, and he had parents that were present, he didn't get raised in a bar, he had actual healthy food, and there was enough stability that his parents had a chance to raise their kid lovingly and maybe expose them to some professional, level coaching and all. I mean, gosh, who knows if he even makes baseball, but he doesn't have to swing a 54-ounce bat and all these other things that he didn't get those advantages, right? It was really hard just to survive. Like there's been a thing going on the internet where they show a video of 1937 or something like that in New York City. And it's like, nobody's fat. Like, well, that's not because they were healthier, it's just because it was the Depression for one. So, and so you have all these preconceived notions and you try to take a multivariate problem and bring it down to one thing. And that just doesn't work. So you can comment on that. I would like to ask you what's interesting to you right now, though, in baseball. What's sticking in your attention besides my kooky time warp questions?
Well, I would say the most interesting thing is going to be pretty clearly what the effects are of all the new rules, right? I mean, that is the
Mhm.
big story in baseball. I would say that it is probably the biggest change that we have seen since. I mean, I'm probably forgetting something massive, but it might be the biggest change we've seen since the mound was lowered in 1969, just in terms of how we see the game as fans, and also
Mhm.
what sort of adjustments everyone has to make on the field. It's funny. I actually don't know if something I should know and don't is a lot has been written about 1968, which
Mm,
was, for those who aren't aware, who don't recall, and I don't recall it. I was only 2, but the pitchers took over the game in 1968, and this had been trending in this direction for the better part of the 1960s. But that was the year that I think the Yankees as a team hit 220 something batting average
yeah,
wise. It was
yeah,
the year that Bob Gibson had the 1.12 ERA. It was the year that Carl Yastrzemski won the batting title with a 301 average. Um, I hope I'm correct about that.
yeah,
And after this trend line had been going, depending on if you appreciate that sort of thing, year after year, baseball stepped in and said, "This is too much. The fans don't want this game, and the fans don't want that game.
yeah,
Uh, they want to see runs scored." And they lowered the mound. They lowered it significantly. I believe from 18 to 12 inches, if memory serves. Um, and the effects were about what you would expect. That all the hitting stats were better in 1969.
yeah,
What I don't know is if the pitchers could feel that, and if they had to make adjustments to what they were doing. And the reason I bring that up is because everyone's going to have to make adjustments this year, because
mm,
so many pitchers, I shouldn't say everyone, the pitchers and the hitters who spent a lot of time in AAA last year are not going to have to make an adjustment, because that's
right,
how it worked last year, roughly speaking. And most of them have said it's tough for a few days or weeks, and then you make that adjustment and you don't even notice it anymore.
yeah,
It could be tough for some of the veterans who don't want to change what they're doing. Why would you? Uh,
yeah,
I've heard very few veterans come out and say, "This is great, totally in favor of these new rules." Uh, a few of them have said, "Yeah, it probably is best for the game, and we'll figure it out." I have been encouraged by the relative lack of complaints that I've heard
yeah,
from players. Somehow they seem to be mostly on board, at least publicly. I'm sure behind the scenes they're some of them are upset, again, especially the older players. But baseball has tried to speed up the game many times over the years, and it's never worked because they just couldn't get the players on board.
yeah,
And then that caused the umpires to stop enforcing the rules. And nothing happened, nothing changed. And so those trend lines just kept, the game times and the time between pitches, which is more important, I think,
yeah,
just kept going up. But this seems like everyone's on board this time, and it's
yeah,
going to make, like, it. I don't think that baseball was designed to routinely last for 3+ hours. I don't think that's what the people who invented the game meant it to be. We know that the people who run the game don't want it to be that way, because they've been complaining about it since the early 1900s, if not before that. So
right,
the only people who want it to last longer are the players, because it when you're doing something incredibly difficult, your natural tendency is to delay having to do that thing,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah,
and to take your time and hope something, there's an earthquake, and you don't have to go up there and hit that 95-mile-an-hour fastball. Sorry, there's not going to be
yeah,
an earthquake. Get up there and hit. There's no. But even if it makes it easier to hit or pitch, it makes it worse for the fans. And one of the things that um, the players lost sight of along the way was that this game, it's not really for the players. It's only for
right,
the players in Little League. Uh, and once you start charging $100 and some for a ticket, it's definitely not for the players. It's for the people
yeah,
who spent $100 on the ticket, right?
yeah,
Uh, and I wrote about this in one of my books quite a bit, and I was fairly skeptical or pessimistic about all of this. And it took my book came out in 2018, I think, and it took 5 years, but it finally happened. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see all the stories. There will be ejections, and there will be complaints and suspensions because somebody gets so upset about a strike 3 being called when they wouldn't get in the box, assuming that the rules
hmm
enforced. But that adjustment period's going to last for a few weeks or a few months, and then ultimately people are going to look back on this moment and say, "Wow, it's a shame that it took so long, but that was great. Good work."
Yeah. I think it's a great baseline. I saw a spring training game, and it really the game until the spring trainingness of the game jumped in. The game was moving along crisply, and then there were a few errors. In the spring training, so you expect these things, and these aren't all major leaguers. But I like the fact that this new memo that came out, and it gives the umpire a lot more control over the pace of the game. So we have a natural pace of get in the box 8 seconds, all these other things that you have to do. But hey, the catcher needs a couple extra seconds. So we're just pause the clock until I'm ready to, because the catcher still has to get their gear on. They got to come out. They got to throw a practice ball down to second base. If you get inside pitch and it knocks you to the ground, it's like you get to give the person like, oh man, it's 100 miles an hour. Ooh, like not long, but the umpire can say, and the umpire can always do that. They can go out and they can go brush the plate off and all those things.
Right.
So I think we'll be okay there. Oh, I wanted to add this point in too. One of the things I think that we don't, and I know you and I've discussed this a little bit, but the nature of the modern ballpark has also had a massive impact on the game. Sucking in all the foul ground and everything that has had a big impact on. It's made it in some ways harder for pitchers because you don't get those free outs like you get in the Oakland Coliseum.
Right.
Going back to the time thing, I wonder, and look, I'm cynical, but having a game be half an hour shorter, that's expensive for the owner.
It's not.
And
it's not.
Like, hey, yeah.
It's not expensive for the owner. That's one
It's
of the
not,
things.
okay.
We don't know yet for
Right.
sure because we don't have major league data, right? But, and I have a little bit of personal experience with this and hearing from people who haven't done it and are worried about it. But I've also talked to people who have done it, and what they have found is that in terms of the you can get really granular with beer sales or merchandise
Sure.
or what, but the bottom line is there are a couple ways of looking at this. One is how much money do people spend at a game? And the answer is that they don't spend measurably less when the game is shorter.
Okay.
And there are various reasons for this, but a couple of them are people spend very little money at the end of a game anyway, right? You're not going to go out and you're not going to buy a bunch of beer and hot dogs and pizza in the 8th inning.
Right.
You're going to eat your supper or whatever. So basically, all the sales figures are lower at the end of a game anyway.
Yeah.
The other reason is a lot of people leave the game before it's over. They don't want to be in the stadium for 3.5 hours or 3 hours, right? I mean, think about how many games you've been to that were not close or they weren't important.
Sure.
And what's the percentage of people who hang around for the whole 3 hours on a weeknight, right?
Yeah.
Or even a weekend.
That's what I'm saying is that's a time hold, that half hour.
Right.
Someone's gonna be like, we can make $1 million extra a game if we sell extra ads, and then you end up with a 3-hour game again.
Well, you mean TV ads?
Yeah, TV ads.
You should have as many breaks. You're still going to have as many inning breaks, and you're
right. We're just sucking in time that was wasted, but they're going to now say, "Hey, that time I can take that back, and we can turn that into revenue."
So that's a good thing. Sure.
Well,
yeah,
maybe unless you don't want 3-hour games,
Well, and the other thing I just wanted to mention is that there's also a macro aspect to this, which people like me have been arguing about, and this is not an original idea at all. I don't remember where I first read it, probably 30 years ago. But I've been arguing this for a long time. If you make the game more entertaining, ultimately, you might have actually more people coming to the games, right? That's the ultimate goal here. People get stuck in this. Well, are we going to sell 4% less beer if the game lasts 2 hours and 35 minutes rather than 3:02? Well, maybe. But what if you have 8% more people actually loving baseball because the game is more fun to watch, right?
Yeah.
Then how much more beer do you sell over the next 20 years? So it's so easy to get wrapped up in the small stuff that you can measure right now. and ignore the big stuff. And I've been arguing for many years that here's another example, that
Hmm.
all those stupid blackout rules,
Oh
right?
my God.
Which leaving aside just the fact that telling someone that they can't watch their favorite team because they happen to live in Iowa or wherever they might live, right?
Right.
If you're in Iowa, you're blacked out from watching the games from all these different markets, even if
How
you're a
about
Royals
LA, one of
fan.
the biggest markets in the world, and
You can't watch a game in Las Vegas, I think. There's all sorts of
you can't
the,
watch in LA unless you have the right cable
well,
provider.
that too, right? Exactly. But
Yeah.
I think if you're in Las Vegas, you don't even have an option
You
at
can't watch
all.
it all. Right. Yeah.
There's all these crazy blackout rules, and
Yeah.
aside from it sort of being mean to your fans in the
Yeah.
moment, you're also discouraging people from becoming fans,
Right.
right? And that
Yeah.
has an impact that lasts for decades. Because if you become a fan when you're
Generations even.
12, right,
Yeah.
generations, exactly. And the short-sightedness that is exhibited in that and many other cases has always been stunning to
Hmm.
me. And this whole thing with the pace, whether it's whether it's taking the long view or not, I think in the long view, it's a huge positive for baseball because
Yeah.
more people want to come to the ballpark, more kids get to stay in the stadium and see the whole game, and maybe see something exciting in the ninth inning that they would have missed if the game lasted 3.5 hours because they had to go
Yeah.
home because they had school the next day. There's all these things, right? And
Yeah.
have some imagination. And so I think it's all. I don't generally say negative things about Major League Baseball because uh, uh, I have various professional responsibilities that discourage
Sure.
me from doing that. Um, I also don't often say positive things because I often have trouble finding positives. But
Mm.
this is a real positive for me, a huge positive. This initiative and the way that they've done the experimenting in the minors and now rolling it out after trying all these different things over the last 3 or 4 years. So I think it's a huge. It's going to go down, I think, as probably the best thing that Rob Manfred ever administered. Put it that way.
I'm I'm excited about the bigger bases. I think about how many times there's a play that's decided by well less than 6 inches. I think about the Dodgers in 2020 easily could not be champions if the bigger base was there, and a Rosarena goes to steal home. He's safe in this case because he was out by half an inch, less than a finger length, right? And so if you leverage that little extra bit of base at that level, that is a big difference. Will someone immediately jump out and steal 80 bases this year? Yeah, probably not. But if I was a GM, I'd hire Ricky Henderson and he'd be teaching everybody how to get a better jump, how to steal better, because now, until we know otherwise, like there's a real opportunity here to get. I don't know how many plays are decided within 6 inches and have to go to replay, but it's more than one a game, it seems like, where
Well, I
that
believe
difference in base
pitchers are
size.
also there's also a limit on how many times a pitcher can throw over to first base, right?
Right, right.
I think
Yeah,
that has a larger effect.
yeah,
And look, we don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if someone stole 80 bases. I wouldn't be shocked if someone stole 100.
right.
That's another in my opinion, great change.
Yeah,
I'm not as wild about that because it does seem, look, with the pace of play stuff, we know that the people who uh, created the game, ran the game, sort of developed the game over the decades between the 1850s and the 19 teens or 20s or whatever, when the live ball came in. We know they didn't want the games to last 3 hours, right?
right.
We have voluminous quotes from people running the game saying it's too slow. We need to speed things up, et cetera, et cetera. This isn't what the fans want. It isn't what we want. Um,
Yeah,
uh, the bases and the pickoff rules, those have been the same since when? 19
yeah,
something, 18 something.
yeah.
Um, and I probably don't tend to be as enthusiastic about that sort of thing. But for various reasons, the running game has declined. I do think that the the best baseball that has ever existed, Pete, was the game in the 1980s. And yes, that
Mm,
happens to be when I was paying the most attention, and I realize that there's probably some nostalgia, but I'm not a particularly nostalgic person. Well, that's probably not
yeah.
true. I've spent way too much time looking at neon signs, but uh, uh, and other things like that. But uh, I'm not nostalgic for baseball in the neon sign era or
Yeah.
the Route 66 era. I'm nostalgic for baseball in the 80s because that's the time when players could hit 40 home runs and steal 100 bases. Not the same players, but
Hmm.
but players did those things. Um, and you could there were pitchers who struck out 4 batters per 9 innings and were successful,
Yep.
and 10 hit per nine and were successful. And we arrived over the last 20 years at this sort of, for lack of a better term, vanilla game,
Right.
which is multi-hued in terms of the players. Fortunately, that's fantastic. We have
Yeah.
these players from all over the world, which is incredible. It's
It's
the
incredible.
best thing about baseball in our era, I think,
Yeah.
is is the international nature of the rosters. The worst thing is that it became stylistically monochromatic. Home
Mm,
runs,
yep.
strikeouts. That's all that
Yeah.
matters.
Yeah.
And also home runs and strikeouts, and it takes 3 hours and 10 minutes to play an average game. Um,
Yeah.
I don't think the home runs and the strikeouts are going away necessarily. Although one thing that is possible, one thing that's been suggested is that if pitchers can't take as long between pitches, it may well affect how hard they can throw,
Yeah.
which may well lower the strikeout rate just a little bit, or at least arrest
Yeah.
the strikeout rate. So again, I think these are all good things.
I mean, these guys are also max efforty. You're turning this into like an endurance sport for these guys, right? And
Right.
so I am curious to see what happens with that. And again, like I'm going to go back to Ricky Henderson in the '80s and Vince Coleman. You recall this, but when a player got on base and you knew Tim Raines was going to run. You knew Ricky Henderson was going to run. Even guys like Devon White, like this guy's going to run. And so there'd be a cutaway screen, and there'd be Devon. He's getting
Right.
his lead, and it's exciting to have this tension, and so in the case of Ricky Henderson, you have Carney Lansford up there spazzing around, like he's moving all over the place, and so there's action there. There's Ricky down low, and you're like, he's gonna go, and then you're watching all this stuff go on, and he's impacting the game from first base. And gosh, if he gets a second base, just please put a cutaway on because I want to see when he's going to go. And it was just so exciting to have that part of the action. And now, because it's so station to station, that whole exciting element has been almost completely removed. No one steals third base ever. And and so I'm hoping that we get a little more of that because now we really have the media ability to show, because like you remember, like when Vince Coleman would take his lead, he would be completely out of the sliding pit, just daring you to either throw behind him because he would run to second base, or like he'd
Right.
just be way out there, and you're like, oh my god, there was excitement all over the field throughout the game, and you just wanted to see someone get on. I mean, imagine if Vince Coleman could get on base, at a clip close to 400 like Ricky, he would be a menace out there. So I'm looking forward to that aspect. I don't know that the shift changes is going to make a big difference in batting average, but I think it'll help a little bit. We can talk about that, but I really want to ask you about Mike Petriello wrote a really interesting article a couple weeks ago, and he took the Homer Simpson nuclear plant softball team that was all loaded with Ken Griffey Jr. and Steve Sachs and Wade Boggs and all these guys. He's like, if you took that team, and not all these guys were all that great at that point in their career, like Darryl Strawberry wasn't really an elite player anymore at that point. um, what would it take? Like, how many of the nuclear plant players, like, what would happen if you just took guys off the street and put them in? And it wouldn't be a very good game to fill out the full 26-person roster, right?
Right.
And then he's like, what if you took slightly below replacement level players, like maybe double A's and that kind of thing? It's like, oh, this team's kind of competitive because it's so top heavy. And what he realized was that if you had a floor that was like one win above replacement, this is a very good team. And this a long way to get to like where the Dodgers and the Rays, where these teams look like everybody was desperate for the Dodgers to make this long-term hundreds of $1 million contract for somebody. And they're like, we're going to be fine because the floor of our team, the floor of our 40-man roster, these things are so high we can allow some patience. We can trade. Look, they have a surplus of talent. Everybody knows that, but they can wait for the opportunity to buy more on their terms instead of spending. I mean, that I love that Judge has this great contract, and I love that Correa got hired, and but ultimately these are going to be hard contracts to justify in 5, 6, 7 years. So when you look at the floor of a team, we're really realizing now how powerful it is to just have someone who's simply above average and never going to be an all-star, but oh my gosh, this person, or they have one trick like I don't know, back when Kike Hernandez was the third best hitter against left-handed pitchers, like you have a guy at the end of your bench who mashes lefties, like, oh, well, that's huge. And it boosts their value up almost imperceptibly. But what a value that is. So I'm curious what your thoughts on the floor of a team and focusing your efforts there, because that's a money ball hidden value thing.
Well, yeah, you need great players to win, no question. I don't know
Right.
that any team's ever won 90 games or 95 that didn't have two or three fantastic players. Maybe not Cy Young or MVP candidates, but
Right.
close, right? Close to
Right.
that level. But the prime example of what you're talking about used to be the Seattle Mariners in the 1990s, who
Mm,
for a spell had Jay Buhner, Ken Griffey Jr., Randy Johnson, and Alex Rodriguez. And how many
right.
playoff series did they win? Not many, right?
Yeah.
And for a stretch, they were struggling just to make the playoffs, and it was
Right.
because they had all these other positions where they just couldn't find. They didn't have good players. They didn't have decent players. There were just some big holes on those teams. And now, of course, maybe the all-time example of what you're talking about is the Angels with Othani and
Mm,
Trout, who
right.
maybe today are the two most talented players who have ever lived. Um,
Yeah.
uh, as I said, I think Ohtani absolutely is the greatest, and Trout, if he isn't the greatest, the second greatest player now, he's in the top five, right, in terms of
Right.
just pure baseball talent. And yes, those two have never, as I recall, been completely healthy at the same time for a whole season. But even if they had been, it wouldn't have made a difference. They still wouldn't have been in the
Right.
playoffs last year.
Yeah.
Um, and that's a failure of the organization not to acquire. It isn't a failure not to acquire great players. It's a failure to not fill in all these other spots. And of course, they've wasted a ton of money. It's only money, but they spent a ton of money on players who didn't pan out,
Right.
who it was pretty obvious wouldn't pan out. Um, these are organizational failures. It's not that difficult to spend money and go out and get Shohei Ohtani. Yes, you have to give them credit for
Yeah.
trying harder and perhaps having a real notion, and you probably attribute this to a scout in their organization who said, this guy can actually be great at both of these things for us. It's going to be amazing because, if you go back and look what they spent on him,
Yeah.
basically it's essentially zero, relatively
Right.
speaking. You have to give them credit for drafting Mike Trout, although there's a lot of luck involved there. Nobody
Boy.
thought he would be this good. Nobody. Because
Right.
if they had, he wouldn't have been, what was he, the 18th pick in the draft or the 17th or something?
Yeah. That's
19th,
right.
somewhere in that range. So there's some luck involved there. What else have they done? It's hard to look at their rosters over the last 5 years and say, oh, here's 6 really great decisions they made. So yes, it's an
Mhm.
organizational failure, and it's a shame those guys, their talents haven't wound up on the big stage in October, which you probably wouldn't write this as fiction because it's so unlikely that they would wind up in that spot in the World Baseball Classic, right? You were
Yeah.
hoping for it, but what are the
Yeah.
chances when this tournament started that it would end with the two best guys facing each other? It was incredible. It was the most, for me, and I never thought I would care about the World Baseball Classic this much or take as much pleasure in that as I did, or
Mhm.
a WBC moment. But um, I think it's honestly one of the greatest moments in baseball history, world baseball history. Um, has there how many better moments have there been in the World Series? Not many,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
that was incredible. It was an incredible thing to watch. And
Yeah.
again, I mentioned Rob Manfred before, but to whatever degree he has played a role in legitimizing the World Baseball Classic, you have to give somebody credit for that.
Yeah. I watched that at bat, and I didn't watch much else of the classic, but I was like, "Oh gosh, this is on, and it's the end of the game." And oh, I missed like, oh, this is the best moment, and you see Otani. The only thing I would change was to get those guys to give each other the nod, like, "Let's go." All
Right.
fastballs, you go for it. Because that happens during throughout the year, and here's a time where you could do that. And in effect, they kind of did. And I saw this great stat. I don't know if you saw this stat, but Trout has swung and missed on three balls like 20 times in his career. Like when he got
He's
struck out.
had 24 3 swinging strikeouts. And that
That's
was
amazing.
yes,
Yeah.
it was amazing. It was absolutely incredible. And I was surprised too that there wasn't any sort of obvious interaction between them, or maybe there was and it was
Yeah.
imperceptible because they know each other presumably so well. Um,
Right. Right.
I certainly would not want Ohtani to throw all fastballs. I wanted him to do whatever he could possibly do to get
Yeah.
Mike Trout
That last pitch wasn't a fastball. It was
one if it was an exhibition game, that would be different. But this was a
yeah.
game for what I believe I read someplace. This almost seems impossible that 97 some percent of Japanese televisions were tuned
Jeez.
into that game when it happened. Think
Yeah.
about that. That seems
Yeah.
almost 97% of anybody would do anything
Yeah.
anywhere.
Yeah. I don't know. You couldn't do that here. We'd all like half of us would hate it.
Yes.
We would
Yes.
get mad at each other. Can I ask you another question or two, or do you got to go?
Sure.
It's
No,
been about
I'm
an
fine.
hour.
Fine till 10:30.
Okay. Um, the other thing I wanted to ask you about, like a team like the Dodgers, the Rays, the A's, all these teams that embrace the sabermetric thing, there's still so much pushback. We've talked about this in general before, but every team now has some kind of office that looks at statistical analysis
Right.
because you're trying to find data that will give you an advantage. And we're not talking big advantages. Like when we talk about like the difference between pitchers and hitters, if you are anything less than like, gosh, if you're one deviation lower than where you need to be, look out. Whatever it is, throwing or hitting, it's going to get exposed because these two things are not that far apart. There's an incredible balance there, like to the point where, hey, you're not a good enough pitcher to go three times through the order. Like, yeah, you probably could do it sometimes, but we're just going to bring somebody else in. That's the difference between success and failure. By the way, I want to mention Brian talking about how Roger Clemens was on the Isotopes and there was no other professional pitcher. So, this is that whole Mike Petriello thing is great. So when we look at the difference between what success and utter failure is, and when you see those crazy pitching ninja videos of like the person who's tunneling and the ball goes like,
Right.
it's like, oh, how do they do it? And yet they do it. Hitters are keeping up. Maybe they're behind, but all it takes is one or two things, and the hitter any advantage at all, and it could be this fatigue thing we're talking about. It's just amazing to me what the difference is between success and failure, and how big the failure is once you can't. Like Adam Kolarek really can't have a reliable major league career, even though he stuffs left-handers. Like they cannot hit him, but he cannot pitch to right-handers. And the three-batter rule, he is a fringe major leaguer. And I think,
Right.
gosh, I love what he does, but how the game is structured now, he's not a viable everyday player.
Are you still there? I feel like I
Yeah,
missed a
I'm still
question.
here.
I feel like I missed a question
I
someplace.
was just talking about like Adam Kolarek and players that are on the fringes of a roster.
Right.
And so if I was just talking about the difference between success and failure and how big the failure can be
Well, especially
compared
for
to
relief
like,
pitchers, right?
right.
I
Yeah.
mean, the that's one of the aspects of the current game that I struggle with,
Mhm.
uh, because when I was becoming a big baseball fan, there was this clear line between a major leaguer and a minor leaguer. Now, sure, there were players stuck in the minor leagues who probably shouldn't have been, but when you rolled into the baseball season, you had your 10-man pitching staff, and you might use all five of those relievers the whole season. I should have some really good examples uh memorized by now, but I think in 1984 the Royals used like 13 pitchers, and two or three of those guys threw like 6 innings, as brief call ups or came up at the end of whatever it was, right? It was basically the same bullpen. So as a fan, all I had to remember over the course of the whole season was, okay, here are 5 starters. I know who those guys are. They're going to pitch all season, which they did, and some years. And here are the 4 relievers we're going to use almost every day, or the 5 or 6. There are very few guys who pitched for the Royals in the early 80s whose names I don't remember. You cannot do that anymore. I don't care how big a fan you are. If you're a Rays fan, I can almost guarantee that there are going to be relief pitchers, a half dozen or a dozen of them that pitched 3 years ago that you have no memory of, because relief pitchers have become so fungible, and starting pitchers as well, although to a much lesser degree. But relief pitchers, they've become so fungible, and they're shuffled in and out so much that it sort of has changed what the definition of major leaguer is. Obviously the definition is you pitched in a major league game, or I would argue that if you're on a major league roster, you deserve to be called a major leaguer. You had the uniform, they could have called on you, they just didn't that night, and then they sent you back down. Well, in my mind, you're a major leaguer, buddy, because you were on that 25-man roster or 26-man roster now. But there are just so many more of them that as a fan, you really can't even hope to know who all these guys are. And for me, that's disorienting. There's nothing to be done about it. That's just the way the game has evolved. But there definitely is an incredibly fine line. And sometimes I feel sorry for the guys who were in AAA and don't wind up making it, because how come he didn't make it? Everybody else on the roster got up at some point. Just call him up for a day or two so he can be a major leaguer too. Really, that distinction between AAA player and major league player has, for the most part, disappeared because of all the roster churn.
Yeah. And guys like Farhan Zaidi and how he runs his team, he's really working this, not only the 40-man roster, but he's scooping up people for the hidden roster, right? And I love the progress of saying, hey, before this guy actually tears his hamstring off of his thigh bone, we're going to sit him down and rest him, and like getting ahead of injury. I think that's great. By the way, a huge advantage if you want to have a career. Like, imagine like in the 30s, if you said, oh, my arm's kind of achy and I feel like my elbow might snap, like, and you're back out there, go ahead and go go through 190 pitches. But that makes the roster enormous, right? Because you're managing 40 slots, but there's so many people you can churn at the bottom. It is hard to keep track of all of the players. And I wonder how that down the road impacts even like the closer is being redefined. So the starter is being redefined, and these roles make it hard to stand up to the historic numbers that have been put up. I don't mean like Cy Young. I just mean in general, like, what does it take to build a really incredible career and be recognized? Like David Cohn is a great example. Is he a Hall of Famer? Gosh, yeah, maybe we're being too hard on him. And I just see us getting even more of that, where someone who is the 7th inning high pressure guy for 10 solid years for organizations, and is reliable and has these really small ERAs, but with big consequence when it doesn't work. How does that person stand out and become an icon in the game and get a jacket and a bust somewhere in a Hall of Fame?
Those are interesting questions, and I don't know. I don't think we're going to know the answers for quite a while. They just put Jim Cott in, and he won 280 some games, right? Tommy John was in, he won 280 something, I think. And now I think Cott's in now. John, I think, will be eventually. The standards are certainly being lowered in terms of the Hall of Fame. In many ways, they're also incredibly high if you are known to have used certain drugs during certain periods of baseball history. And the standards are definitely going to change because the statistics are changing, as you suggest, and the playing time is changing, and the number of innings you're being asked to throw. So yeah, it's really unpredictable. Also, the voting body changes all the time, and they change the rules for the Hall of Fame, the voting rules all the time. So yeah, it's incredibly fluid. I have no idea what the Hall of Fame process is going to look like or the results will look like in 20 years. I don't think anybody can. Um,
Yeah.
they're the Hall of Fame and the voters are they will be responding to so many different constituencies that it's almost impossible to know what they're going to
Oh
wind up
my gosh.
looking like.
Yeah. Who are you excited about this year? Like, what teams do you want to follow and pay attention to?
Ooh, that's a good question. I tend to well, I tend to root for the underdog. So I guess I would say that I don't really have any favorites or pay attention to any specific teams until the season gets going and we
Hmm.
realize who's interesting, who's got a chance to be surprising and do some things they haven't done before. I do live in the Pacific Northwest and have a lot of Mariners fans as friends. And and there seems to be a lot of energy around that team because they were
Mm.
better last year than people thought. Um, they didn't really do much to improve themselves over the offseason, but they're exuding a lot of positive energy. So I think that sort of um,
Yeah.
has an effect on the fans in a positive way. Um, I'm curious about what they actually look like when they start playing, but hoping that they do well. And if they're playing well, I'm sure I'll pay more attention. I'm trying to think of some other teams that that I typically uh, pull for.
Are
I've
the
gotten to the point in my
Padres?
life when I tend to pull for teams whose owners I don't revile and
Yeah.
who have nice uniforms or who
Right.
have good broadcasters. I mean, it's sort of there's all these things that go into this sort of
Yeah.
stew, this baseball team stew, and for me, the things that go into the stew change all the time. Um,
Are the Padres underdogs? I'm curious what you think about that because they're not. Yeah.
well, I don't. I think they remain underdogs in the National League West because the Dodgers are so good and win every year. They're certainly. I don't think that any team that spends as much money as they have spent can be considered underdogs for making the
Hmm.
playoffs, or for me, sort of emotional underdogs.
Mm.
I did root for them last year to beat the Dodgers just because it would have been a better story than the Dodgers winning again, right?
Right. Right. Yeah.
So I guess in that respect, and I love their uniforms since they made the change to brown 20
Yes.
years too late. Um, I enjoy the ballpark.
Yeah.
Um, the one thing I'll say about the Padres is I think that there is a an argument that we should root for the Padres because they went out and did spend the money, even though
Right.
they don't play in a big media market. They don't presumably have, uh, they're not in the top 10 in revenue or whatever that might be. Um, and I am sympathetic to that impulse where I might have said this before on the show. It's one of my pet peeves. I don't think it's fair to get upset with every team that doesn't do what the Padres did. Because while, yes, almost everybody can afford to spend more money than they spend, there is a finite supply of players worth spending the money on.
Mm.
So
Hmm.
if you want to make an argument that every team should spend way more than they spend already, all you're really saying is not every team should try harder to win because they can't all try hard enough to win. What you're saying is the owners should give a lot more of their money to the players. And that's an argument. I'm fine with the
Sure.
argument. I don't really see why it matters if who has the money, whether it's a billionaire or a millionaire. To me, those are the same because you're still have all the money that you need, if that
Right.
makes sense. Um,
No, it does.
I don't. It doesn't really matter to me if the owner of the Padres has all the money or the players on the Padres have all the money. I think that's sort of an
Mm.
irrelevant um, issue. Um, I also am not all that interested in watching teams win because they spent the most money, right?
Yeah.
There's no drama there, really.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
The only drama comes when you spend the most money and you lose. That to
Yeah.
me is interesting. and that
Yeah.
could happen, but it's not likely with the Padres because they have so many good players who are still in their physical primes.
Yeah. The one of the things I like to say, like when I'm talking to baseball people on Facebook, is as much as you want to be down on Manny Machado, the guy is in the middle of a Hall of Fame career. Like
Oh,
he may
sure.
not make it because sometimes these things happen, but if he at all trends towards a normal decline, this guy's going to have 3,000 hits. He started so young, and people get really down on certain players like that. Like we all want to see what Tatis Jr. is going to do. Hopefully, his career stabilizes and we get to see the special player he appears to be. But he's got the wrong kind of trend. You're like, I'm old enough to go. If he gets there, that's great. But something unusual is going to have to change with him, and I don't know what it is. So it's easy to put these things on players. I want to push that to the side. I'm in this group called Dodgers United. I told them I would mention them on the show and everything because I like what they do, and it's not a bunch of craziness, right? Because the fans get a little crazy sometimes. But across the board in the Dodger forums where I've talked in Facebook is they're so hard on the team. This is a great team. It's a team that said when they first got this new ownership group and Andrew Friedman came in, he's like, we're going to always compete. We're going to build a farm system. Yes, we're going to get big players. We're going to do all these things. Nobody discovers, rehabs, salvages, develops young player. Oh my God, they do like there are so many aspects where they lead the industry to get talent onto the field that they don't have to go out and sign a $500 million or $400 million contract very often, and they're not known to do that very often. But the thought is that if you're the best team in the playoffs, that you just get to the World Series and you win it. But you and I know better, right?
Right.
And it's not because Doc is a bad manager. It's because at the jump of the playoffs, the best team is, I don't know, we don't know the new number because we've only had the new system for 1 year really, but it's a number that's pretty close to 20%. And it could be right about 21% by my gauge. But it is really it's a 1 in 5 proposition that the best team makes it. And by the way, the Astros were also a very good team, and so they get their share too.
Absolutely. I mean, the idea that any team should be expected to win the World Series more than once every 5 or 6 years is ridiculous, right? Sure.
Yeah.
The problem is that every once in a while, and it hasn't happened often, but some team goes out and wins 3 in a row, like the Yankees
Right.
did
Yeah.
a while back, or the Yankees did from 1949 to 53 when they won 5 in a row.
Right.
Um, that was unlikely enough. They probably went into, on average, they probably went into each of those World Series with a 55% chance of winning or 60% chance because they probably were the best team.
Right.
Except maybe in, I think, 52 or 53, the Dodgers were really, really good and just didn't win. It was really unlikely for the Yankees to win 5 straight when they only had to win 1 series. It was
Right.
incredibly unlikely for the Yankees to win 3 straight when they had to win 2 series, or they had to, I think, 2 series, right? Now, when you have to win all those games, it's really tough. Even if you are the best team, even if you're clearly the best team. And Joe Sheehan has written about this quite a bit over the years. Fans have this mentality that if you don't do this incredibly unlikely thing, your season was a failure.
Yeah.
But all you can do, and baseball people understand this, all you can do is build the best team. And then, as Billy Beane said famously, my shit doesn't work in the playoffs, which is it's pithy, obviously, and it's reductive. But the actual truth of the thing is, it isn't that his doesn't work in the playoffs. It's that nobody's works in the playoffs. Right. Even if you somehow decided to build a team to succeed in the playoffs, which I'm not even sure how you would do that, because I don't believe there's some magical formula. There are probably a few little things you can do, and I'm sure that there's literature on this. You might be able to go from your 21% to 23%. And yes, that's probably worth doing, because if that's your job, then yes, go ahead and try to tack on those couple of extra percent, but it's still essentially a crapshoot. And if fans who don't understand that are going to be perpetually disappointed.
Yeah. I remember I think it was the last year that the Cubs won. I guess that was 15. Maybe it was the year before. Um, or, but Doc and the Cubs were going at it, and he managed to create a situation where Aroldis Chapman came in early. Like you knew he wouldn't go to the end of the game, and so if you scratched out a hit, wow, that would be a super benefit. But no matter what, you had an ideal situation where you're like, okay, Aroldis is out of the way. The next inning, we're going to get someone who's not their best pitcher. It didn't work out for the Dodgers. It just didn't. Like you create this dynamic, and then you say, okay, this is our best shot, and then so and so doesn't get a hit because it turns out it's really hard to do these things. And so you have this, people didn't even remember this moment. I'm like, what a brilliant managerial move to create these dynamics where he gets the guy in early. Poof, didn't work. Bad move. Like, I don't, it's like, come on, we got to be reasonable about the tiny things. And again, the 2020 Dodgers, I'm using them as an example because I'm trying to talk to these guys. But a Rosarena could be safe. I don't know if Jeremy Giambi was ever out. I know that they called him out when he came to. I don't know if that's even true, and that play wasn't supposed to happen anyhow.
Well,
these things are so.
Dave Roberts thinking about the stolen base against the Yankees, right?
Oh my gosh! Yeah, right,
I mean,
right.
He didn't have to be safe. He did.
Right.
Yeah, he got a great jump, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But he was safe by a couple of inches.
Yeah, right. Inches, not a long thing. Yeah.
Baseball history looks a lot different if those inches go the other way. So
yeah.
And so many series over the years, so many incredibly famous, impactful postseason series have hinged on one play that could easily have gone the other way. So to suggest that anything's preordained or that you failed if you didn't win this year, whatever it is, great teams have been swept in postseason series. And it wasn't because they all of a sudden weren't great anymore. It's if the other team played better than them over the course of 4 games. That's it.
That's it. Well, listen, I've had you for almost an hour and a half, and I know you got to be done by 10:30. Is there anything else you want to add in before I wrap this up?
Oh, gosh. I'll just mention that I am thrilled that the Kansas Jayhawks are out of the basketball tournament because now I can shift all my energy toward baseball, which is sort of my cutoff point every year. And I'm really excited about MLB starting next week. And as you know, my baseball season starts in early June. So I have
that's right.
Just a little bit over a couple of months until my summer turns into that. That's what I do. That's what I do for 2.5 months is watch collegiate summer baseball and try to squeeze in a few MLB games along the way. But mostly it's West Coast League baseball and the lovely Pacific Northwest. And then in the fall, I shift back to the big stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to turn things into verbs. Like, so when you're commissionating during the year, it's
I usually say commissionering, but commissionating is more fun. So I'm gonna go with that one from now on.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you're not commissioning because you're the commissioner. So you have to add something in there. It's fun to do those things. But is that your favorite time of the year?
You mean my season?
Yeah, like when you look at your year, is that like the most enjoyable time?
No, it is not, because there are. It's kind of like the fantasy baseball team, right?
Mm-hmm.
The most fun of a fantasy baseball team is the prepping and the drafting. And then the season starts and all of a sudden your players start getting hurt. Well, all of a sudden my baseball season starts and head coaches start getting ejected. And I have to start suspending people and dealing with all the things that come up in a baseball league over the course of a season. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of things I love about my job during the season, going to the ballpark specifically. But my job is basically consists of solving problems and dealing with issues, and I don't sleep a whole lot. So it's a relief when the championship game ends and I can take a deep breath for the first time in 2.5 months. So no, I would say that the only time I really work hard, Pete, and I know that I'm very fortunate. The only time I work hard is from opening day through the championship game, and the other 9.5 months of the year for me are pretty idyllic. I get to go on
Mm.
podcasts and do a lot of reading and do a lot of hiking and climbing and all those fun things.
Yeah.
So I actually have to work. What's that? Yeah, I actually have to work pretty
Yeah.
hard for 2.5 months. I'm very
Well, I appreciate.
thankful that we play a short season.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate that you get a chance to do it. And I like to say that I am the pretender to the assistant commissioner of the Western Coast League, because it's not actually true, but I'll just like, yeah, I know the commissioner. No, I don't throw my weight around like that. Oh, there
Your
it is.
pay is a
That's
free
fine.
cup.
Oh, look at that. Yeah. Do you wear a suit? Like, do you think, oh, I've got to wear like a 3-piece suit, or you just wear trousers and
Don't own a suit, and
nice?
I do not own a suit. I have a few ties. I don't own a suit. I have a few sport coats, but I'm trying to think. I do dress up a little bit for our league meetings, our board
Okay.
meetings,
Yeah.
during the off season. But uh, summer collegiate baseball is largely a t-shirt, golf shirt, shorts
Right.
type of. I will wear decent trousers when I'm going to be doing something official, but no, it's pretty casual. It's a nice
Yeah.
part of the job. It's usually like 90 to 100 degrees in August most of our games. So
Yeah.
yeah, we dress cool. Yep.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm going to go. I'm going to run the credits. Thank you so much for hanging out. I love it. It's always a pleasure to have you on, Rob.
It's great to be here as always, Pete. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very grateful.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to run them.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank